Okay, so today I'm in London talking to Matthew Trenhaile. Thanks very much, Matthew. After a few faux starts, I've managed to get you in the seat. When I asked you what you do or how to describe yourself, you said rather self-depreciatingly, "I'm a betting industry nerd." So we'll go straight into that. I mean, why would you say that?
Well, it's a little bit of a joke. So my father used to always use nerd as sort of a very derisory word, and he would always. Funny thing is, he's a very academic guy, and I think a lot of people associate nerd with the idea of just someone who really swats at school or something like that. But he would always say no, a nerd is someone who just accumulates useless information. He said, don't be that. He says, if you want to learn about something, put it into practice, do it. That's fine. A profession or a discipline or whatever it is. But yeah, so he said nerds just accumulate useless facts. And I thought to myself, I almost sort of embraced this in a little way, because I thought to myself, yeah, I have spent most of the last 20 years basically not turning away any information on the betting industry. And it turns out some of it is useless. It turns out some of it's been quite useful over the years. So yeah, so I'm sort of happy to embrace the nerd thing. But I've got to the point now where I've got a good few people who will just sort of call me up and ask, do you know anything about this? And I think to myself, I do actually know something about that, yeah. So I'm quite happy to be a nerd in that regard.
Okay, now I've had to do a fair bit of research on you. One thing I've found is that you're extremely highly respected amongst people in the betting industry. A lot of people have said, what a sort of talented and nice guy and all the rest of you. There's so much you've done though, so I'm just going to dive into the first thing that piqued my interest. You worked for a golf betting syndicate for 18 months, Mustard Systems. I mean, what does working for a setup like that entail? I mean, what role did you play in it?
Well, I can't speak for every syndicate, but the ones I'm sort of more closely familiar with, generally you need a group of, or at least a mathematician, more often than not, someone to do coding and someone to do trading. That sort of little triangle seems to be fairly consistent from what I have seen. And quite often, one of those areas can be more important to the area that you're in than another. But in the case of, golf, you need guys who can come up, find a way to model the sport, and that normally requires some, a decent level of mathematics. And then you need people who can convert that into code, and then you need people to watch over. The dream is always to get something as automated as possible when you're betting, something that can scale, so you can do, whether it's horse racing or golf or football or whatever, more bets, more matches, more leagues, more races, the better. So always the coders are important to be able to get that scale. And then, the traders are they're generally to spot when the maths looks like it's doing something that is counter intuition. Now, quite the challenging part is that quite often what is counterintuitive is the best betting spots, where it feels uncomfortable. That's often where the best value is in these things. But they can also spot things just where, the maths can't take into account this very obvious factor, and it's probably too hard to code something that would work, so it's better to have a human watching. And of course things just stop working, so you need a human to be able to hit the kill switch and be able to stop it. But my capacity was trading the model that they built, and I did it predominantly for the European tour at the time. And yeah, it's just a case of proprietary trading in that scenario is predominantly on the exchanges. But we try to monetize the true probabilities that we come up with as best as possible. Classical example is a lot of people try to do a bit of insurance if they can. So people who want to insure against big sponsorship payouts, that kind of thing. I want to say that Paddy Power had a division that did that for some time, and Sports Risk and some of these other companies. The gouging that goes on in the insurance industry. If you're Manchester United and you want to insure against paying bonuses to everyone for winning the treble or something like that, insurance companies will give you 3-1 about it or something ridiculous. And whereas I think a lot of people in that smart betting world thought, well, we can be more competitive there, but hard to get that business generally, it seems. But yeah, so yeah, from my perspective, it was just generally give feedback to the math guys. Math guys look at it, tell me whether there's anything about my instinct or not. If we need to make a change, goes to the other desk, goes to the coders, and comes back, and that's the sort of circular route. There can be, there are syndicates that aren't based around math models, based around teams of runners going around betting shops and these kind of things. But most of my experience has been around the guys who try to beat the exchanges, that kind of stuff.
And was it already a proven winning syndicate before you joined, or were you part of that evolution?
The owner had a long history of winning at, I'd say, just about anything he touched. But I think the golf had originally been just a sort of a personal pet project of his, and then it came out that he sort of set it, he really tried to grow it. But yeah, I think for a lot of the big exchange syndicates, it's sort of the same problem repeating over and over again. How do we come up with the best true probabilities? Once we've got that, how's the best way to place the bets on the exchange to optimize getting matched versus, getting the right prices? And yeah, that's sort of generally, it sounds, I don't want to be a killjoy, but quite often the initial approach is, whether it's football or basketball or golf, it seems like we go through the same iterations each time, and it can be quite sort of similar. Find data, build model, find best way to bet model, rinse and repeat for different sports. But it's funny because people who do sports tend to try and go into other sports, but horse racing often sort of has its own. Horse racing is a sort of a exceptional challenge to model, I would say, and so it tends to attract people who've sort of dedicated themselves. People like Jelko and the Woods Group and people like that. They're pretty hyper focused on it because you've really got to be on the ball there.
Okay, and I was interested to read that early in your career, and we are flicking around a bit here, but early in your career, you were trading golf, but you're also pricing and trading rugby. Why? How did those? What is their connection? Is it just because you knew about those sports, or was it thrust upon you and get wised up on this? How did that come about? It seems an unlikely bedfellows.
Obviously, you need public school boys to trade rugby union, so I suppose that was it. To be honest, it was a luxury at the time to even have people who did multiple sports, but the spread betting guys were able to employ multiple people on good salaries to do different things. I started on golf because, first of all, I really liked the guys who were working on golf anyway at the time, but the fascination was that they had a pretty decent golf tournament simulation. This is in 2000 or whatever. And the joke at the time was, it's not rocket science, but it actually is. And the joke was because the guy who built the original one had worked for a British NASA equivalent. So that was it. And this was the first time I'd ever seen anything, the very concept of mathematically modelling a sport. And there were other sports around at that time where no one was using any mathematical models, but golf was. And so I was just straight away, I want to be involved with that. I played golf and I watched a lot of golf, and I was like, that just seemed obvious. But then in time, I suppose, arrogance of youth, but I kind of chafed a bit at it. And after a while, I wanted to try something different. And I knew rugby, I'd played rugby. So, and there's not many people who want to do rugby. Generally, like a lot of new young guys join. They're interested in horse racing or football a lot of the time, and it's kind of hard work to find people for other sports. So we had one guy doing all the rugby union, and it was early noughties. There was a boom in the amount of rugby being shown on TV, and so I ended up doing that. So I never really did them both at the same time. But yeah, I switched over to that, and yeah, very different. It's very hard to model rugby, generally. And then once you watch the game, there's a lot that goes on the pitch in rugby that is sort of hard to quantify, but it's like you can see such a physical attritional game. You can often tell, okay, they're keeping it up all right now, but second half, they've been battered, they've tackled, and like I'm sure now you can get these nice running stats of tackle counts, and I'm sure that's all of it. But back then, you kind of had to be aware that you sort of be seeing like, oh, this looks quite competitive, but in the back of your mind, you're thinking, this isn't going to go well for these boys in the second half, or the wind was massively one direction or the other, or God, sloping pitches back in the day, and all this kind of stuff. So, so it felt like, even though golf is an individual sport with a lot of psychology in it, they sort of mathematized it strongly, whereas rugby just felt like voodoo dark arts a lot of the time, and I found myself second guessing myself a huge amount of the time.
And were the sharks in the water betting on rugby?
Yeah, I would say the pool of like very smart people was I'd say smaller, but they really knew it inside out. I mean the pinnacle of rugby betting in my time, I don't know whether he bets now, but was the head of rugby at Sporting Index at the time, and yeah, I'd say he was felt like impossible to beat, to be quite honest. But yeah, there was a lot of other people, and it's one of those games where even people who aren't professional punters, who just really know the game inside out, and the new starting fly half would come in, and you'd be thinking, I don't know, looks like a kid, you know, is he any good? But this person would have like watched them like play like under 15s, and like, this kid's the next starter for Wales, and you'd be like, oh shit, I didn't know. Like, it's one of those things where just being a passionate fan of the sport could get you an edge. You might not know exactly, you know, what the price should be, but you would often know, well, there's no way the bookmakers have factored in the little piece that I know. And so people would make money just on that. And of course, people who just happened to live near the bloody ground and knew when the rain had started was the other inevitable. I remember the first time when we had to start looking for webcams, and we found that people had webcams for just bizarre reasons. Like, you just have a webcam on the top of a church spire in a town, or bird watching webcams. And it would just so happen that they would be next to the ground. And like, you'd go on BBC at the time and it would just have like sun and cloud just over Wales. And then you look on the webcam, it's like, it looks pissing down to me. So like, that was the first time we had to really go out and try and find decent weather information. But yeah, it was very, very different the way they did golf and rugby at the time.
So did you build up like a network of sort of informants from various clubs and that sort of thing? Was that all part of the game?
We did not do that at the time as much as possibly would have been sensible to do, but we did have, so there was a lovely chap, Ian Davies, who used to speak to every bookmaker in the UK about rugby, and he'd call up at the beginning of the week, and the funny thing is you'd speak to him and says, oh yeah, I just spoke to the guy at Ladbrokes and he said he quite fancies this, and you knew that this was a merry-go-round of information. And the funny thing is that it probably benefited us all, because it probably stopped anyone, if someone knew that so-and-so someone was injured or something like that, that kind of information got into the network. But he was at the centre of all of it. And it's funny because he, you know, had a sort of a strong Welsh accent, and people used to be able to, you know, the phone would, you know, you'd hear one of the bet takers shout out, got Ian Davies on the phone for you, and like, well, yeah, you knew that you'd have he was a lovely guy, and you'd have a good chat, but you invariably knew that you were not only hearing his opinions, but sort of the aggregated opinions of all the other people he chatted to. So it was like, a bit like a human rugby tissue, if you like.